Evan was 24 years old and already exhausted. Not from work, not from effort, from noise. The kind of noise that lives inside the mind. He would wake up and before his feet even touched the floor, his phone was in his hand. Messages, news, videos, notifications, 1,000 small fragments pulling at him, each one stealing a piece of his attention. By the time he stood up, he already felt behind. Behind on life, behind on himself. Evan worked as a junior designer at a small marketing firm. It wasn't a bad job, but every day felt the same. He sat in front of a screen, switching between tabs, emails, social media, half-finished projects, half-finished thoughts. He was always busy, yet nothing meaningful ever got done. At night, when he finally went home, he would lie in bed scrolling until his eyes hurt. He would think about the things he wanted to do, learn new skills, start his own business, become someone focused and disciplined, someone who didn't feel scattered all the time. But those thoughts never turned into action, because every time he tried to focus, something inside him rebelled. He would open a book and 5 minutes later reach for his phone. He would start a task and suddenly remember something else he needed to check. He would sit down to work and feel a strange restlessness in his body, like he was being pulled in 10 directions at once. Evan told himself he was just tired, that he needed more motivation, that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow never was. And that quiet failure, the daily betrayal of his own intentions, started to build a weight inside him. Not dramatic, just heavy. The worst part wasn't that he was distracted. It was that he knew he was wasting his life. He knew he had potential. He could feel it, somewhere beneath the chaos, but he couldn't access it. It was like standing in front of a locked door with the key in his hands, but being too scattered to use it. One night, after missing yet another deadline at work, Evan sat alone in his small apartment. The room was dark except for the glow of his phone. He had been scrolling for almost an hour. He didn't even know what he was looking at anymore. And suddenly, something inside him snapped. He turned off the screen and stared at the ceiling. "I'm disappearing," he whispered. Not dying, disappearing. Moments turning into hours, hours into years, years into nothing. That was the moment Evan realized something was deeply wrong. Not with the world, with his mind. And for the first time in his life, he didn't try to distract himself from that truth. He just sat there, feeling it. Evan did not sleep that night. He lay in bed listening to the soft hum of the city outside his window, the distant sirens, the low vibration of traffic, the subtle pulse of a world that never paused. His phone rested on the table beside him. For once, he did not touch it. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind tried to run, to escape, to replay conversations, to imagine future versions of himself that never seemed to arrive. But something inside him was tired of running. He felt hollow. That afternoon, he did something unusual. He left work early, not to escape, to search. He walked without direction, letting the city move around him. He passed bookstores, cafes, temples, old buildings, new glass towers. The world was full of things, but his mind kept slipping past them. Eventually, he found himself in front of a small, quiet bookstore he had never noticed before. The sign was faded, the windows were dusty. Inside, the light was warm and still. He stepped inside. The air smelled like old paper and wood. A man stood behind the counter, late 50s maybe. Calm eyes, a presence that felt grounded. Evan didn't know why, but he walked up to him. "Do you have anything about focus?" Evan asked awkwardly. The man studied him for a moment, then smiled slightly. "I think you're not looking for focus," he said. "You're looking for stillness." Evan didn't know how to answer that. The man reached behind him and pulled out a thin book with a simple cover. He placed it on the counter. Ichigyo Zammai. "One thing, one mind," the man said softly. "A Zen principle." Evan picked up the book. "What is it?" The man leaned forward slightly. "It is the art of giving yourself completely to one action, No division, no fragmentation. When you walk, you walk. When you read, you read. When you work, you work. Not partly, entirely. Evan felt something stir inside him. "But I can't," he said quietly. "My mind won't stay." The man nodded. "Of course it won't. You trained it not to." That sentence landed like a stone in water. You don't have a broken mind. You have a trained one, and it has been trained to be distracted. Evan swallowed. "Can it be trained back?" The man smiled. "Yes, but it will feel uncomfortable because for the first time you will stop running." Evan bought the book. That night he sat on his bed and opened it. The words were simple, almost too simple. Do one thing at a time. When the mind wanders, return. Again and again. There was no magic, no promises, just practice. And for the first time in years, Evan felt something close to hope. Not loud, quiet, like a candle in the dark. Evan began the next morning with a strange mixture of curiosity and fear. The book lay open on his desk. Ichigyo Zammai. One thing, one mind. The instructions were almost offensively simple. Choose one action, remove everything else, stay. No dramatic ritual, no inspirational quotes, just presence. Evan decided to start with something small, writing an email. He sat down at his laptop and closed every tab except the one he needed. The silence of the screen felt uncomfortable, too empty, like a room without furniture. His phone buzzed on the desk. He didn't pick it up. Instead, he slid it into a drawer. The moment he did, his body reacted. A subtle anxiety crawled through his chest. His mind started whispering, "What if someone needs you? What if something important happens? What if you're missing something?" Evan realized something terrifying. The noise wasn't outside, it was inside. He placed his hands on the keyboard. One email. That's all. The first sentence took him almost a full minute to write. Not because he didn't know what to say, because his mind kept trying to leave. Every few seconds, it wanted to jump, to open a tab, to check a message, to escape. He noticed it and gently returned. Again and again and again. After 10 minutes, something shifted. The anxiety softened, the noise dimmed, the words began to flow. When he finished the email, Evan leaned back in his chair. It wasn't perfect, but it was complete. And for the first time in a long time, he felt present. That afternoon, he tried it again. One design task, one mind. The first 15 minutes were torture. His body felt restless, his thoughts raced. But then, like sinking beneath the surface of water, everything grew quieter. He was no longer Evan struggling to focus. He was the work. Time slipped. When he finally looked up, an hour had passed. He had finished something meaningful, not half-finished, not abandoned. Finished. The next few days were not magical. They were difficult. Ichigyo Zammai did not feel peaceful at first. It felt like withdrawal. His brain had been addicted to novelty, to stimulation, to escape. Now it was being forced to sit still. Sometimes, Evan would get up mid-task and pace the room, feeling a strange itch in his body. Not physical, psychological. The urge to do something else, anything else. But he kept returning. One action, one mind. Slowly, something unexpected began to happen. He started to feel more. The sound of rain against the window, the texture of paper under his fingers, the rhythm of his own breathing. Life became sharper, not louder, clearer. At work, his productivity changed. Not because he worked longer, because he stopped leaking attention. Tasks that used to take hours now took minutes. His boss noticed. "Something's different," she said one afternoon. "You're more here." Evan didn't know how to explain it. He just nodded. Inside, something was growing. Not confidence, clarity. He began to understand something Zen monks had known for centuries. Your mind is not meant to be everywhere. It is meant to be here. But then came the first real test. One evening, Evan came home exhausted. The old habit called to him. Scroll, watch, disappear. He stood in his doorway, staring at the couch. The pull was strong, almost physical. He wanted to give in, just for tonight. But he remembered something he had read. Every time you choose distraction, you teach your brain that presence is optional. He sat down at his desk, opened his notebook, and stayed. The urge slowly faded, not because it was defeated, because it was ignored. That night, Evan slept deeply. No racing thoughts, no restlessness, just quiet. And in that quiet, something fundamental was changing. Not his schedule, his identity. Evan did not realize at first that focus would make his life harder before it made it better. He thought that once he learned how to stay with one thing, everything would suddenly feel calm and organized, like a room that had finally been cleaned. But what he discovered instead was that when the noise faded, the buried things came up. Distraction had not only been stealing his time, it had been protecting him from boredom, from anxiety, from the quiet fear that his life was smaller than it should be. Now that he was practicing Ichigyo Zammai, those emotions had nowhere to hide. One afternoon, Evan sat at his desk working on a design project. He had closed every unnecessary tab. His phone was in another room. His breathing was slow and steady. The work was going well. And suddenly, a wave of sadness hit him. Not sharp, heavy. It came out of nowhere. A feeling that he had wasted years, that he had let so many days slip away while he scrolled and dreamed and waited for a future that never arrived. His hands hovered over the keyboard. The urge to escape returned, not into another task, into numbness. He wanted to pick up his phone and let the endless stream of content wash the feeling away. But Ichigyo Zammai was not about running. It was about staying. Evan closed his eyes for a moment and let the sadness be there. It hurt, but it was real. When he returned to the work, his hands were shaking slightly, but he kept going. That was when he understood something crucial. Focus doesn't just bring productivity, it brings truth. You can't run from yourself when you're fully present. Over the next weeks, this pattern repeated. Sometimes focus felt peaceful, other times it felt unbearable. His mind would throw up images from the past, old embarrassments, missed opportunities, conversations he wished he had handled differently, faces of people he had drifted away from. Distraction had always been his shield. Now the shield was gone. But something else was growing in its place, strength. Not loud strength, quiet endurance. The kind that says, I will stay here even when it hurts. At work, Evan's performance kept improving. He finished projects early, his designs were sharper, his thinking clearer. But his internal world was turbulent. Late one night, he sat on his bed with the Ichigyo Zammai book in his hands. He flipped to a page he had underlined. When the mind resists, it is because it is being retrained. Resistance is not failure. It is evidence of change. Evan read that line again and again. The resistance he felt was not a sign he was doing something wrong. It was a sign he was doing something right. One evening, he went back to the small bookstore. The man behind the counter was there again. I think it's getting harder, Evan said. The man smiled gently. Of course it is, he replied. You are no longer running. Evan sat down in one of the wooden chairs. I feel things now. I can't hide. That is the point. But it hurts. So does waking up after a long sleep. Evan nodded slowly. I thought focus would make everything easier. It makes everything honest, the man said. Easier comes later. At home, Evan began to apply Ichigyo Zammai beyond work. When he ate, he ate. No phone, no videos, just the food. At first it felt strange, like he was missing something. Then he realized he had never really tasted anything before. When he walked, feeling the ground under his feet, the air on his skin, the sound of the city. He wasn't lost in thought, he was here. The more he practiced, the more he felt like he was waking up from a long trance. But the old patterns did not disappear quietly. One night, after a stressful day, Evan broke. He picked up his phone and scrolled for hours. Videos, messages, nothing. When he finally stopped, it was past midnight. His head felt foggy, heavy. He felt ashamed, not because he had used his phone, because he had abandoned himself. The next morning, he woke up with that familiar hollow feeling. The voice inside him whispered, "You failed. What's the point?" Evan sat on the edge of his bed. He remembered something else he had read. Returning is the practice. So he made his bed. He sat at his desk. He opened his notebook. One action, one mind. And slowly, the fog began to lift. That relapse taught him something important. Ichigyo Zammai was not about being perfect. It was about returning. Every time you come back to the present, you are strengthening the mind that stays. Weeks passed. Evan's coworkers started to treat him differently. They trusted him with more responsibility. They came to him for clarity. He wasn't louder. He was steadier. At night, his thoughts were quieter, not empty, ordered. For the first time in years, Evan felt like he was actually living inside his own life. And that scared him, because now he could see what he wanted, not abstract dreams, specific desires. He wanted to do meaningful work. He wanted to be someone reliable. He wanted a life that wasn't lost to distraction. Ichigyo Zammai was no longer just a technique. It was becoming his identity. And identity always demands sacrifice. The old Evan was fading, and part of him mourned that. But a deeper part felt something else, relief. Because for the first time, he was no longer split into 1,000 pieces. He was one mind, one life, one direction. And even though the path was hard, he was finally walking it. The strangest thing Evan noticed was not how much he could now get done. It was how little he wanted to escape. Distraction had always been his refuge, a place to hide from uncertainty, boredom, fear, and the quiet pressure of his own potential. But now that he was practicing Ichigyo Zammai, that refuge was collapsing, and in its place, something steadier was forming. A sense of self, not the kind that came from achievements, the kind that came from presence. Each morning, Evan woke up and did one thing first. He sat on the edge of his bed and took 3 slow breaths. Not meditation, not discipline, just an arrival. A way of telling his nervous system, we are here now. Then he made his bed. That small action was not symbolic to him at first. It was simply something he did. But over time, it became a quiet anchor. No matter what kind of day he was about to have, it started with something finished. One action, one mind. At work, he continued to use the same simple structure. One task, no notifications, phone away, mind here. Some days were smooth. Some days felt like trying to hold water in his hands. But the returning never stopped. What Evan didn't realize yet was that his brain was being physically rewired. Every time he noticed a distraction and gently came back, he was strengthening the neural pathways responsible for focus and impulse control. The prefrontal cortex was growing denser. The default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for mind wandering, was slowly quieting down. But he didn't know that. All he knew was that his mind felt less like a storm and more like a lake. Still, deeper layers of his old self continued to resist. One Friday night, some coworkers invited him out. Drinks, loud music, the kind of night where everything dissolves into stimulation. The old Evan would have gone without thinking. This time, he hesitated. Not because he didn't want to socialize, because he knew what usually happened. Hours of noise, scrolling, drinking, waking up feeling scattered. He felt torn. Ichigyo Zammai wasn't about becoming a monk. It was about being present. So he went, but he went differently. He left his phone in his pocket. He listened when people spoke. He noticed the way laughter rose and fell. He was there. And something surprising happened. He enjoyed it more because he wasn't half elsewhere. When he left, he wasn't drained. He was full. That was another small revelation. Presence doesn't isolate you. It connects you. Back at home, he sat quietly for a few minutes before sleeping. He felt grounded. Not perfect, grounded. Weeks turned into months. The changes in Evan were subtle, but profound. His boss offered him a more complex project. His designs improved. His thinking became sharper. But more importantly, his relationship with himself changed. He no longer felt like someone who was always running late to his own life. He was here. When anxiety came, he noticed it. When boredom came, he stayed. When fear came, he breathed. Ichigyo Zammai was no longer something he practiced. It was something he was. And that was when the deeper test arrived. A message from his mother. Your father is in the hospital. The words hit him like cold water. Old panic rose. His mind wanted to scatter, to imagine worst-case scenarios, to escape into worry. But he didn't. He sat. One breath, one moment, one mind. Then he called her. The hospital was quiet, the air heavy. As Evan sat beside his father's bed, he realized something. In the past, he would have been half there, checking his phone, thinking about work, wandering. Now he was fully present. He held his father's hand. He listened. He stayed. Later, walking home through the evening streets, Evan felt a deep gratitude. Not for the situation, for the capacity to be there for it. That was the true power of Ichigyo Zammai. Not productivity, presence. And presence is the foundation of every meaningful life. The strangest thing Evan noticed was not how much he could now get done. It was how little he wanted to escape. Distraction had always been his refuge, a place to hide from uncertainty, boredom, fear, and the quiet pressure of his own potential. But now that he was practicing Ichigyo Zammai, that refuge was collapsing, and in its place, something steadier was forming. A sense of self. Not the kind that came from achievements, the kind that came from presence. Each morning, Evan woke up and did one thing first. He sat on the edge of his bed and took 3 slow breaths. Not meditation, not discipline, just an arrival. A way of telling his nervous system, we are here now. Then he made his bed. That small action was not symbolic to him at first. It was simply something he did. But over time, it became a quiet anchor. No matter what kind of day he was about to have, it started with something finished. One action, one mind. At work, he continued to use the same simple structure. One task, no notifications, phone away, mind here. Some days were smooth. Some days felt like trying to hold water in his hands. But the returning never stopped. What Evan didn't realize yet was that his brain was being physically rewired. Every time he noticed a distraction and gently came back, he was strengthening the neural pathways responsible for focus and impulse control. The prefrontal cortex was growing denser. The default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for mind wandering, was slowly quieting down. But he didn't know that. All he knew was that his mind felt less like a storm and more like a lake. Still, deeper layers of his old self continued to resist. One Friday night, some coworkers invited him out. Drinks, loud music, the kind of night where everything dissolves into stimulation. The old Evan would have gone without thinking. This time, he hesitated. Not because he didn't want to socialize, because he knew what usually happened. Hours of noise, scrolling, drinking, waking up feeling scattered. He felt torn. Ichigyo Zammai wasn't about becoming a monk, it was about being present. So he went. But he went differently. He left his phone in his pocket. He listened when people spoke. He noticed the way laughter rose and fell. He was there. And something surprising happened. He enjoyed it more because he wasn't half elsewhere. When he left, he wasn't drained. He was full. That was another small revelation. Presence doesn't isolate you. It connects you. Back at home, he sat quietly for a few minutes before sleeping. He felt grounded. Not perfect, grounded. Weeks turned into months. The changes in Evan were subtle, but profound. His boss offered him a more complex project. His designs improved. His thinking became sharper. But more importantly, his relationship with himself changed. He no longer felt like someone who was always running late to his own life. He was here. When anxiety came, he noticed it. When boredom came, he stayed. When fear came, he breathed. Ichigyo Zammai was no longer something he practiced. It was something he was. And that was when the deeper test arrived. A message from his mother. Your father is in the hospital. The words hit him like cold water. Old panic rose. His mind wanted to scatter, to imagine the worst-case scenarios, to escape into worry. But he didn't. He sat. One breath, one moment, one mind. Then he called her. The hospital was quiet, the air heavy. As Evan sat beside his father's bed, he realized something. In the past, he would have been half there, checking his phone, thinking about work, wandering. Now he was fully present. He held his father's hand. He listened. He stayed. Later, walking home through the evening streets, Evan felt a deep gratitude, not for the situation, for the capacity to be there for it. That was the true power of Ichigyo Zammai, not productivity, presence. And presence is the foundation of every meaningful life. Evan began to realize something that made him deeply uneasy. Focus was no longer something he did. It was something he was. And when that happened, life stopped feeling like a game of possibilities and started feeling like a series of consequences. Before Ichigyo Zammai, everything in Evan's life had been soft. Dreams were vague, plans were loose, mistakes were easily buried under distraction. Now, things were sharper. When he made a choice, he felt it. When he avoided something, he knew it. There was no haze to hide in anymore. One morning, while sitting at his desk before work, Evan noticed that he felt strangely nervous. Nothing was wrong, but something was different. The familiar mental noise was gone, and in its place was a quiet expectation. He realized he was no longer waiting for life to happen. Life was waiting for him. That was terrifying. With distraction, he had always had an excuse. I was busy. I didn't have time. I wasn't in the right mindset. Ichigyo Zammai had taken those excuses away. Now, if he didn't do something, it was because he chose not to, and that meant responsibility. At work, he was given a new project, bigger than anything he had handled before, more visible, more important. The old Evan would have felt overwhelmed. He would have doubted himself. This Evan felt something else, a quiet tension, not fear of failure, fear of being seen. Because if he succeeded now, it would be real, and real success changes who you have to become. That night, Evan sat at his desk staring at the project outline. The urge to distract himself was strong, not because the work was hard, because it mattered. He felt exposed, and the mind hates exposure. The mind wants comfort. The soul wants growth. Ichigyo Zammai asked him to choose. So he did. The only thing he knew how to do now. He stayed. One page, one line, one decision at a time. As he worked, something began to happen. The fear didn't disappear. It transformed into energy, into clarity, into movement. Days passed. Evan's project progressed steadily, not with frantic bursts, with quiet consistency. His coworkers noticed, his boss noticed, but most importantly, he noticed. For the first time in his life, he was not sabotaging himself. He wasn't starting and stopping. He wasn't drifting. He was building. There was a moment late one evening when he finished a difficult section of the project and leaned back in his chair. He felt tired, but he also felt something else. Respect. Not from others, from himself. And that was new. Ichigyo Zammai had given him that, not by making him special, by making him present. The changes in Evan's life did not announce themselves. There were no dramatic moments, no sudden celebrations, no loud victories. There was only a slow, steady shift. He woke up and felt less scattered. He worked and felt more grounded. He slept and felt more rested. Not because life had become easier, because his mind had become simpler. What he felt instead was something quieter. He felt here. The morning light slid across the wall as he opened his eyes. For a moment, he simply lay there, breathing, not thinking about what he had to do, not checking what he had missed, just feeling the air enter his lungs and leave again. This was how his days began now. Not with urgency, with presence. He stood up, made his bed, and opened the window. The city was waking up. Somewhere a car passed. A bird called. The world moved, but it no longer dragged him with it. He moved with it. Ichigyo Zammai had removed the constant background noise. The endless whisper of "what else?" that had haunted him for years was slowly fading. And in that quiet, something remarkable was happening. Evan was learning who he was. Not the version of himself that imagined big futures, the version that showed up for small moments. At work, the big project was nearing completion. Evan wasn't anxious. He wasn't rushing. He was just working. One section at a time. One decision at a time. His boss came by one afternoon and watched him for a moment before speaking. "You're different," she said. "You don't look stressed, but you're more focused than anyone here." Evan smiled slightly. "I just stay with what's in front of me." That was the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. The day the project was delivered, Evan didn't feel a rush of excitement. He felt a quiet satisfaction. Not because it was perfect, because he had not abandoned it. That night, he went for a walk. The city lights reflected on wet pavement. He thought about the man he used to be, the one who never finished things, the one who was always elsewhere. And he realized something. He didn't miss that man. He felt compassion for him, because that man had been afraid. Afraid to commit. Afraid to stay. Afraid to become real. Ichigyo Zammai had not made Evan fearless. It had made him steady. And steadiness was stronger than courage. As weeks passed, his life continued to align. He was offered a small raise, a new role, more responsibility. But none of it felt overwhelming, because he had learned the only skill that mattered: how to give himself fully to one thing. That skill had quietly mastered everything else. Evan's days had begun to feel different. Not faster, fuller. There was a kind of weight to his hours now, a density that came from actually being inside them. He was no longer skimming the surface of his own life. He was living in it. Each morning when he woke up, there was no scramble for his phone. He noticed the light in the room, the quiet before the city stirred, his own breath rising and falling. These small moments used to disappear unnoticed. Now, they felt like the beginning of something sacred. At work, he had become known as someone who could be relied upon. Not because he was the most brilliant, because he was always present. When a problem came, he didn't panic. He didn't look for an escape. He stayed with it until it was understood. That presence had a gravity. People felt safe around him. One afternoon, a younger coworker came to him. "I can't concentrate," she admitted quietly. "My mind is everywhere." Evan listened. He didn't lecture. He told her a simple thing. Try doing just one thing at a time, and when your mind wanders, bring it back. Again and again. She looked doubtful. Evan smiled. "I know it sounds too simple, but simple is not easy." At home, Evan's evenings were no longer swallowed by screens. He read, he wrote, he sat. Sometimes he did nothing at all. And in that nothing, he felt something profound. Peace. Not the absence of problems, the absence of noise. Ichigyo Zammai had given him that, and with it, a life that finally felt whole. Evan did not wake up one day feeling like a new man. There was no moment where everything suddenly made sense. No dramatic realization, no final victory. Later, as he walked to work, Evan noticed something that would have been invisible to him before. The way people rushed, the way their eyes were always somewhere else, the way their hands kept reaching for their phones as if something might disappear if they weren't watching. That had been him, and he felt a quiet sadness for that version of himself. Not shame, understanding, because that Evan had never been lazy, he had been lost. Lost in a world that constantly demanded attention and gave nothing back. Ichigyo Zammai had taught him a different way to live, not by giving him more information, but by giving him back his mind. At work, Evan sat at his desk and opened a single document. One task, one screen, one mind. He didn't think about the rest of the day. He didn't worry about what came next. He worked. And in that work, he felt something almost spiritual, a sense of alignment. This was what Zen masters meant when they spoke of becoming the action. When you wash dishes, you are washing dishes. When you walk, you are walking. When you live, you are living. Not planning, not escaping, living. Evan finished his work and leaned back in his chair. There was no rush of excitement, just a deep, quiet satisfaction, because he had kept the promise to himself. Weeks later, Evan sat in the same small bookstore where this had all begun. The man behind the counter was there, as calm as ever. "You look different," the man said. Evan smiled. "I feel different. Tell me." "I don't feel pulled apart anymore. I don't feel like my life is leaking away through distractions." The man nodded. "You have learned Ichigyo Zammai." Evan looked down at his hands. "I thought it was just a way to focus, but it became something else." "It always does," the man said softly. "Focus is only the door. Presence is the room." As Evan left the bookstore, he felt something settle inside him. This wasn't the end of a journey. It was the beginning of a way of being. He knew there would still be hard days. There would still be moments of doubt. Distractions would still try to pull him away. But now he knew something he had never known before. He could return to this breath, to this step, to this action. One thing, one mind. That was enough. And if you're listening to this, you already know what that feels like. The moment when you stop running, the moment when you stop waiting, the moment when you finally stay. You don't need more time. You don't need more motivation. You need one small act of attention. Right now, whatever is in front of you, give it your whole mind. That is Ichigyo Zammai. And that is how you take your life back.